There's something deeply strange about the way humans die. Not from the unexpected, not from the invisible, but from the things they could see coming, clearly, obviously, and chose to ignore anyway. In 79 AD, the residents of Pompeii watched Mount Vesuvius erupt. They stood there. Some people fled toward the sea, others into the nearby countryside. But many decided to huddle inside their home's history, and based on what archaeologists have pieced together from the body positions and locations of remains, a significant number appear to have delayed leaving even as ash began to fall. Around 2,000 people at Pompeii never made it out. On the Titanic, the most famous shipwreck in history, the first lifeboat launched with approximately 28 people aboard. It had a capacity of 65. The two officers had tried for some minutes to encourage passengers to board, but they were reluctant to do so. Wikipedia. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. Psychologists believe that roughly 70 to 80% of people would do the exact same thing, not because they're stupid, not because they didn't see the signs, but because of something buried so deep in your brain, it might already be shaping your decisions right now, and you have absolutely no idea. So what is actually happening inside the human mind when we ignore something that is staring us right in the face? The answer is a cognitive bias called normalcy bias. And once you understand it, you'll start seeing it everywhere, in history, in the news, and if you're honest with yourself, in your own life. Normalcy bias is the tendency to underestimate the likelihood or impact of a negative event. It's a mechanism that leads people to disregard any signs or warnings that they are in danger, even when those warnings are explicit and clear. But here's what makes this really fascinating. It's not a flaw in broken people. It's a feature of every human brain. It evolved for a reason. Think about the world our ancestors lived in for most of human history. For most of that history, most days were normal. Threats were rare. Warnings frequently turned out to be false alarms. The brain was shaped by this statistical reality to treat normalcy as the default prediction and to require strong, repeated evidence before updating toward an abnormal scenario. In other words, your brain learned from thousands of years of experience that probably nothing is actually wrong, and most of the time, that calculation was correct. But here's the brutal catch. When it's wrong, it's catastrophically wrong. Now here's something the disaster movies get completely wrong. When danger arrives, people don't run screaming. They don't act like action heroes. They don't even react like the calm, rational adults they imagine themselves to be. They mill. According to a 2001 study by sociologist Thomas Drawbeck, when people are asked to leave in anticipation of a disaster, most check with 4 or more sources of information before deciding what to do. People in emergency situations typically ask around 4 people on average what's going on before taking any action. 4 people, while the building is on fire, while the ship is sinking, while the storm is making landfall. Studies of the World Trade Center evacuation on September 11, 2001, found that a large majority of survivors spoke with others before evacuating, even as the emergency was already unfolding. Why? Because nobody wants to be the person who panicked over nothing. There's a social cost to being the alarmist. If you grab your bag and run, and it turns out to be a drill, you feel ridiculous. Nobody wants to be perceived as alarmist or overreactive if it turns out to be a false alarm. Conformity bias reinforces normalcy bias. If the people around us aren't taking a risk seriously, we follow their lead. So we look around, we see other people not moving, and we think, okay, they know something I don't. This must be fine. And collectively, everyone stands still, all of them waiting for someone else to confirm that it's real. This is how a ship with enough lifeboats to save far more people still loses 1,500 lives. This is how an entire city doesn't evacuate. This is not stupidity. It's a social feedback loop, and it's terrifyingly predictable. Now, before you sit back and think, well, I'd definitely be the one who runs, let's talk about where this actually shows up in everyday life. Because it's not just hurricanes and shipwrecks. Think about the last time you noticed a warning sign in a relationship and explained it away. The comment that felt a little too cutting. The pattern of behavior you told yourself was a one-off. The moment that nagged at you for weeks and you just didn't address it. Think about the business that ignored a competitor for years. In September 2000, Netflix co-founders Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph walked into Blockbuster's offices and offered to sell their company for $50 million. John Antioco, CEO of Blockbuster, thought the offer was a joke and declined, saying the dot-com hysteria is completely overblown. Less than a decade later, Blockbuster was bankrupt. To be fair to Antioco, Netflix was losing money at the time, and the dot-com bubble was genuinely collapsing around them. What this suggests, more than simple arrogance, is something subtler. When your current reality feels stable, evidence of a future threat gets filtered through the lens of what's normal right now. The warning signs were there: streaming technology, shifting consumer habits, the economics of physical media. But from inside a working system, everything still looked fine. Confirmation bias leads people to hold strongly to false beliefs or to give more weight to information that supports their existing views. People may become overconfident because they've accumulated evidence to support their position, while overlooking a great deal of contradictory evidence that, if considered, would force them to question everything. We're not just blind to external danger. We're blind to the internal evidence that we're wrong. And this is where it gets personal, because the most dangerous version of normalcy bias isn't the one that kills you in a disaster. It's the one that lets a bad situation quietly become your new baseline. It's how people stay in the wrong job for a decade, how early health warning signs get rationalized for years, how financial problems get minimized until they become catastrophic. The brain doesn't distinguish between a volcano and that chest pain you've been postponing for 3 months. The mechanism is identical, so let's go deeper. Why does the brain do this so reliably? This isn't a random glitch. It's a structured, predictable process. Research suggests that even when the brain is calm, it takes 8 to 10 seconds to process new information. Now add stress, adrenaline, and social pressure to that equation, and that processing time expands dramatically. The brain under crisis doesn't speed up, it slows down. It starts searching for familiar patterns, and when it can't find them, it defaults to the last familiar pattern it does have: normal. Author Amanda Ripley, who spent years researching how people behave in disasters, found that human response follows 3 predictable stages. She identifies denial, deliberation, and the decisive moment. In the first phase, people deny that a disaster is happening. In the deliberation phase, they have to decide what to do, and if there's no plan already in place, life-threatening stress limits their ability to perceive information and make decisions. The faster someone moves through denial and deliberation, the sooner they reach the decisive moment where action becomes possible. The key word there is plan. The people who survive disasters fastest aren't necessarily the bravest or the most rational. They're the ones who decided in advance what to do. The decision was already made before the crisis hit, which meant the brain didn't need to process anything new, it just executed. This tells us something profound. The antidote to normalcy bias isn't willpower in the moment. It's preparation before the moment arrives. But most people never do that. Because, and here's the cruel irony, normalcy bias also prevents you from preparing. Because preparing means admitting that something could go wrong. And that feels like a threat to the very sense of normalcy the brain is trying to protect. Let's go back to Pompeii for a moment, because the story is even more layered than most people know. The Romans were accustomed to minor earth tremors in the region. The writer Pliny the Younger even noted that earthquakes were not particularly alarming because they are frequent in Campania. Small earthquakes began taking place 4 days before the eruption, becoming more frequent, but the warnings were not recognized. That detail changes everything. The warning signs weren't invisible. They were familiar. The tremors were just tremors, because tremors had always been tremors. The volcano, which had not erupted in recorded living memory in the region, simply did not fit the mental model of what a real threat looked like. What we can infer from the archaeological record, the bodies found in homes, in doorways, in sheltered rooms, is that a meaningful portion of the population stayed not from ignorance, but from a deeply human failure to connect familiar signs to an unfamiliar catastrophe. This is the most human thing in the world. We measure danger by what we've personally experienced. The availability heuristic causes people to rely on how easily details about events come to mind. Things that are recent or emotionally vivid feel more salient and probable. Events that are less vivid, however statistically relevant, get underweighted. A pandemic that happened a century ago feels abstract. A car crash you witnessed last week feels like constant danger. Your brain is not processing probability. It's processing memory and emotion. This is why entire generations can rebuild in flood zones, in earthquake corridors, in hurricane paths, and be shocked when disaster strikes. It's not denial in the dramatic sense. It's that the brain has no emotional reference point for something it's never lived through. And the terrifying extension of that logic. The most dangerous threats we face are often the ones that feel the most unlikely, not because they're improbable, but because we haven't personally felt them yet. Here's the good news. Understanding this bias is genuinely useful, not just intellectually, but practically. Because awareness, it turns out, is a real lever. Research in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics has shown that interventions aimed at increasing awareness of biases can have a positive impact on decision-making. By heightening awareness, individuals are more likely to activate analytical reasoning, leading to greater vigilance in evaluating information and considering alternative perspectives. But awareness alone isn't enough. It needs to be paired with something concrete. The military has understood this for a long time. You don't train soldiers to think clearly under fire. You train them to execute specific responses to specific triggers. When X happens, you do Y. The decision is pre-made. The brain doesn't need to process anything new under stress. It just follows the script it already wrote. The same principle scales to ordinary life. Want to stop ignoring warning signs? Stop relying on willpower in the moment. Define your thresholds in advance. Not might, not probably, will. If the doctor mentions that test again, and I keep postponing, I will book it today. If this relationship makes me feel smaller every single week, that pattern means something. If the company I work for has been quietly losing its best people for a year, I already know what that trend is pointing toward. The signs were never invisible. They were just waiting for you to decide, in advance, that they mattered. So here's where I want to leave you. We don't ignore warning signs because we're careless. We ignore them because we're human, because our brains were built to prefer the familiar, to seek social confirmation before acting, to trust the pattern of what has always been over the signal of what is coming. Normalcy bias has been described as one of the most dangerous biases we have, not because it's rare, because it shapes roughly 70 to 80% of people in a crisis, and quietly governs the rest of their ordinary decisions too. The residents of Pompeii weren't foolish. The passengers on the Titanic weren't cowards. They were people with human brains, doing exactly what human brains do. The question isn't whether you have this bias. You do. We all do. The question is, what warning sign are you looking at right now, explaining away, waiting for someone else to confirm, before you finally decide to move? Because the lifeboat doesn't wait forever.